You're listening to the Lakewood Vineyard Podcast. We are part of a family of neighborhood churches called the Mile High Vineyard. For more information about our church or those we are connected to, please go to lakewoodvineyard.org. Stay tuned at the end of our podcast for ways you can respond personally to what you've just heard.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you guys so much for being here. My name is Kyle, and as you might be able to tell, I am one of the leaders of our young adults ministry, and I'm really excited to be preaching with you guys this morning. Part of our young adults ministry is that we have a little Bible study we like to do on Saturday mornings, and yesterday we were talking through the book of Ecclesiastes. And in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is this element where the author starts laying out all of the possessions they've had, all of the things they've built, all of the things they've experienced, kind of to lay out why they've tried everything, they've done it all, and none of it means a whole lot. And in chapter 2, verse 7, the author says this. He says, "I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. And I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem." Centuries later than that text was written, there is a sermon that was delivered by a preacher, and he writes something that is powerful and profound in relationship to what he calls this boast of the author of Ecclesiastes. He says, "What is such a gross example of arrogance? In an opulent house, an abundance of vines, ripeness in vegetable plots, and collecting waters in pools, and channeling them in gardens, as for a human being, to link himself the master of his own kind." He says, I got slaves and slave girls, and homebred slaves were born for me. What do you mean? You condemn man to slavery when his nature is free and possesses free will, and you legislate in competition with God, overturning his law for the human species. The one made on the specific terms that he should be the owner of the earth and appointed to government by the Creator. Can you bring him under the yoke of slavery, as though defying and fighting against the divine decree? You have forgotten the limits of your authority. For what price, tell me? What did you find in existence worth as much as this human nature? God said, "Let us make man in our own image and likeness." If he is the image and the likeness of God and rules the whole earth and has been granted authority over everything on earth from God, who is his buyer? Tell me, who is his seller? Now that's a powerful quote. And it would be easy to assume that comes from maybe the 1800s during the abolition movement. It may surprise you to find that quote comes from the 300s AD. Gregory of Nyssa, he is an early church father who is credited with helping iron out the doctrine of the Trinity. He said that. And what's radical, what is wild about that statement is, as far as I can tell and as far as I've looked, we do not have a single statement like it, even close to its denunciation of the institutions of slavery anywhere earlier or close to that time. As far as I can tell, Gregory of Nyssa is the first individual that we have in written history to condemn the institution of slavery that strongly. In many ways, he was wildly ahead of his time. But most of us have not even heard of Gregory. And part of that is because he was a part of a family of heavy hitters. He had a brother named Basil of Caesarea and a sister named Macrina. And Basil is essentially credited with starting the very first hospital and homeless shelter, and Macrina with seeking out abandoned infants on rubbish heaps in Rome and raising them as her own. And so out of their legacy came hospitals, orphanages, homeless shelters, things that were absolutely radical and costly in Roman society, and so radically informed by the way of Jesus. But Gregory, his words did not resonate with the church for almost, actually more than 1,000 years. It took us until the 16, 17, 1800s to finally grapple with what he saw before the Trinity had even been ironed out. And for me, this is incredibly convicting. Because what we have in Gregory is someone who lived so outside of his own time. He was so enraptured with Jesus. He followed the implications of the teachings of Jesus and of Scripture so fully to their own conclusions that he could remove himself from the water that everyone else was swimming in and see a radical new vision for what God intended. And I want to ask, when you think about your own life, when you think about the church, how often are we navigating completely separate cultural waters and changing the game in a revolutionary way because of the example of Jesus? And how often are we just swimming in the waters of our culture? And this goes, since politics is like everything these days, this goes to the right and for the left. We are very culturally conditioned. And I want to ask you as an individual, how much of your life is informed by the way of Jesus in a way that radically challenges the culture around you? And how much of your life is a part of that culture? It's not an easy thing to say, and I'm a hypocrite for being up here and saying it to you. But I think it's worth asking. And so when it comes to asking ourselves, okay, how do I step outside of my cultural waters? How do I step outside of the assumptions and the moral frameworks that are just a given, right? The necessary evils that we accept. Gregory's own brother, Basil, publicly wrote that this was a nice sentiment from Gregory, but it wasn't realistic. Slavery was necessary. It was a necessary evil. It would be around. And in a sense, Basil was quite right. But even Basil, who's going out here and starting homeless shelters, and he's starting hospitals, even he can't quite see that level of, radical shift. And so I want to turn now to the Abraham story, which may surprise some of you, because I think it has a lot of wisdom for us to glean as to what it looks like to exist outside of the expectations of our culture. And Abraham provides us both positive examples and some really negative ones, too. Christian, last week, he unpacked the calling of Abraham in Genesis 12. And before I get to Abraham, if you're anything like me, I grew up not really knowing what to do with Abraham. I mean, you have creation, you have the fall, you have the flood, you have the Tower of Babel, all these cosmic global things, and then it's Abraham, and he's kind of like wandering around doing stuff for like 20 chapters or something. And it's not immediately clear why we're getting all of this. And we all know Abraham's important. We all know Abraham's significant. 3 of the world's biggest faiths are Abrahamic religions. But I don't think most of us really know what to actually do with Abraham when he's in front of us, because are we supposed to follow his example? There's a lot of stuff in there that feels maybe not. But he's a big deal. So surely, right? And so I think what's helpful, at least for me, is to realize that Abraham's story it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not in isolation. It's part of Genesis. Genesis has its own themes, its own motifs, its own ideas that it's working out. And Abraham's story is a key part in them. But what we have to do is get out of our own cultural ideas and assumptions about what you do with stories. And we need to hop into the context Genesis lays out for us. So I want to really quickly recap where we've been in the series and kind of hit on a few things that we weren't able to talk about, and then kind of develop into where Abraham goes. So hopping all the way back to Genesis 1, I promise I won't get into all of this stuff. There's an important refrain that I mentioned when I taught this passage at the beginning of this series that I think is really, really important for the entire book of Genesis. And it's during creation week, that when God is creating things, what we have is this repeating refrain where it says, and God said, let there be blank, and there was blank, and God saw that it was good. The Hebrew word there is tov, right? And so the really important distinction I want to highlight is God is not just deciding it's good, not just declaring it's good, he's perceiving, he's seeing that it's good. That sight, that perception is going to be really key for the rest of Genesis. When we get to chapter 2, God is also the one who sees what is not good, not tov. We see in Genesis 2:18, he says, it is not good for the human to be alone. I shall make him a sustainer, often translated a helper, beside him. That word, helper, ezer, it's a Hebrew word that is otherwise almost exclusively attributed to God. God is my help, my deliverance. It's usually in the Psalms, crying out for help. It's not helper like maid. It's deliverance, sustenance. It's a statement of the fact that it is the very first thing that is not good in creation is man being alone. And so the creation of woman becomes a form of deliverance, of sustenance, of enacting the mission God has for his people, his representative images. That's huge. That's going to come into play later. The important thing I want to highlight, though, is who has the eyes to see what is good in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. You'll likely notice it's God. God is the one who sees what is and is not good. When we get to Genesis 3, we get an interesting twist on that theme. The serpent talks to the woman, she's at the tree. And what we get in Genesis 3, 6 through 7 is, and the woman saw that the tree was good, tov, for eating, and that it was a lust to the eyes, and the tree was lovely to look at. Big emphasis on what she's seeing. Now notice, this tree is supposed to grant the knowledge of good and evil, good and not good, right? She hasn't eaten from it yet, and she's already making a judgment call. There's a profound irony here that's very intentional. And it's not the only irony. The serpent tempts her by saying, if you eat this, you'll become like God. And guess what? They're already the image of God. They're already like God. So it's multiplying ironies, right? And so what we see is that in this moment, she makes a judgment call, and she says, this looks good to me. So she took of his fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband, her man with her, and he ate. And the eyes of the two of them were opened. She takes, she gives, she eats. That'll come into play later. And so what I think is key here is that the sin of humanity absolutely seems to follow from our desire to thrust off God's perspective of what is and is not good and to decide instead what looks good in our own eyes. When I think about the Roman Empire, around the time that the Christian movement was beginning, this is a very simple but profound understanding of how things like their value set existed. I mean, in Roman society, it was literally moral to be powerful. It was moral to be higher in status. Ergo, it was immoral to be weak. To be a slave, to be a woman, to be a lesser status male in that society was not just shameful, it was immoral. That is what was good in their own eyes. Part of what made the Christian movement so radical is it redefined what's good, such that even today, we intrinsically associate being the oppressed or the persecuted as a form of power, a form of goodness. That it is better to be that than to be the oppressor. Romans would not have understood that. We have Jesus to thank for that paradigm. So, returning to Genesis, God looks at what they've done. He comes out, he says, where are you? What have you done? All these things. And he begins to go into a poem that, depending on what scholar you talk to, is either a curse or a lament. But in Genesis 3:15, he states this really important promise that's going to echo through not just the rest of Genesis, but the rest of the Bible. If you want to really understand what a lot of the Old Testament is working towards, this verse is key. He says in Genesis 3:15, God says, I will put hostility between you, the serpent, and between the woman, and between your seed, your offspring, and her seed. He will strike you on the head, and you will strike him on the heel. The rest of the book of Genesis is going to be about working out what seed, who is the seed, who is this chosen either individual or people who are going to crush the head of the snake. And the rest of the Bible is going to tell you it's both. It's God's people and it's our Messiah in Jesus who's going to accomplish that. After this, Adam and Eve are exiled east of the garden, like Michael talked to us about. Cain and Abel follow in their footsteps, fall into sin, are exiled east into the wilderness. The flood happens, which again is tragic to skip over, but have to. Tower of Babel happens. The people build it in the east, and then they get scattered into the wilderness, right? And out of that scattering, we get the calling of Abraham. And whereas Adam and Eve wanted to be like gods, and whereas the Tower of Babel, the people wanted to have their heads up in the heavens and make a name for themselves, here's God calling Abraham out from all of that and saying, I will make your name great, right? I will make you a blessing to the nations. I will bless those who bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. God commits himself. And this is This coincides with the covenant God makes after the flood too, with Noah about why he's not going to destroy mankind because he knows they're sinful, which is a weird phrase to say. He does a similar thing here. He is committing himself to a fallible human being. And part of the Abraham drama is going to be working out what that looks like. And so actually, immediately following the calling of Abraham, he does do something really radical and countercultural. He does leave his homeland, right? He does go to the land of Canaan. He goes west, back symbolically towards Eden. And the first thing he does is he builds an altar on a hilltop by a tree. It's a very Edenic picture, and he's worshiping Yahweh. And normally in that culture, when you go into a new land, the first thing you do is you offer sacrifice to the gods of that land, right, to pay them homage. And here's Abram, noticeably not paying homage to the Canaanite gods, but to Yahweh, right? So he starts off good. But then in the same chapter, a famine comes, and he immediately goes down to Egypt. And this is a pattern that's going to get played out a lot in Genesis. And he goes and he lies about his wife, calls her his sister to protect himself. There's a whole matrix of links to Genesis 3 where Abram actually gets linked symbolically to the serpent who's being deceptive. His wife becomes the fruit. Pharaoh becomes Adam and Eve taking it. It's fascinating, but we don't have time for that. And so Abraham is being cast not in a great light. He's not Abraham yet. But God, because of his commitment to bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, brings plagues on Egypt and Pharaoh. It's not that Pharaoh's in the right. I mean, he was still just assuming he can take any woman he wants. Like, he's not great. But Abraham is more in the wrong here. And God still kind of comes in on Abram's side. That's a tension that the narrative wants to play with, and it's going to keep doing over the course of the story. After that, Abram does come back to the land. He and Lot pick their little allocations of land, and then Lot gets captured. And so Abram assembles 318 men, and he goes and chases them down, rescues his nephew. He meets Melchizedek, super weird, so cool, not time for it, and kind of comes back. Everything's settled. And Abram kind of realizes, by this point, it's been some time since the promise that God made to Abram, Genesis 12. And Abram's realizing, like, I don't have descendants. I don't really have the land. I have a small plot of land here. I'm not really sure how much of the promise is playing out. And so just as Christian talked to us last week about waiting faithfully and patiently, there are some ways in which Abram has done that. But there are a lot of ways in which he hasn't. For example, dipping immediately. And so this brings us to today's passage in Genesis 15, 1 through 6. I'm going to read this really quickly. After these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward will be very great." Then Abram said, "O Yahweh, my Lord, what will you give me? I continue to be childless, and my heir is Eliezer of Damascus." And Abram said, "Look, you've not given me a descendant, and here a member of my household is my heir." And he brought him outside, Yahweh brought him outside, and said, this will not be your heir, your son will be your heir. He said, "Look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you can." And he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." And Abram believed in Yahweh, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So again, if we're sitting in Genesis, what Genesis is interested in exploring is themes like blessing and curse, the blessing of creation and the curses that followed sin. And now the blessings and the curses that follow God's commitment to Abram. It's also interested in following this theme of the seed, right? We're tracing lineage. The book of Genesis is structured according to 10 genealogies, which themselves are structured after the 10 words that God speaks in Genesis 1. The whole book is tracing the lineage of the seed because the snake crusher. That's what it's all about. And so here's Abraham, knowing he's been promised this and saying, I don't even have a kid. And you said I'm going to be a great nation. I don't even have a land, right? And there's a parallel story that immediately follows this one where God's going to also make a covenant with Abram and promise him the land. We're not getting into that today. But there's a few really cool little details that are going to seem so specific, but I promise they're really relevant. And a lot of it has to do with this weird mention of Eliezer of Damascus. This dude never shows up until this point and is never mentioned again. And that's always a red flag in the Bible. When something just shows up out of nowhere, that's a red flag. You should pay attention to it. There's two things that are really interesting that highlight that this is definitely an intentional detail. The first is that Eliezer of Damascus, Hebrew, you can assign numbers to letters. It's a very normal thing. They don't have a number system. Their letters are their numbers. Eliezer of Damascus's numerical value is 318, which is the exact number of men that Abram had with him when he goes and rescues Lot a chapter earlier. But on top of that, and more importantly, that's a cool gem. But more importantly, Eliezer literally translates to El-Ezer. That's the sustainer word I mentioned earlier. It means God is my sustainer, my help. It's the only other time in the entire book of Genesis that Ezer shows up. And so here's what's interesting. This only shows up elsewhere when God is kind of completing the not good of humanity, right? He is providing a deliverance, a sustenance, it's not quite a seed, but another human being, right? He's multiplying, he's blessing the human beings, causing them to multiply in a way that kind of completes them. He's making another human, right? And the entire book of Genesis is tracing this seed of, well, now we all need a deliverance. Now humanity as a whole needs deliverance. We're all in not good. And we need some hopefully down the line, someone who will crush the serpent, who will crush the not good. And will save us, will be our help, will be our sustenance, our deliverance, right? And here's Abram saying, right now my only heir is God is my help. And God's saying, actually, Eliezer's not your only heir. I'm going to make sure I follow through on my promises. I'm going to be good on that. In the very next section of Genesis, immediately after this story, God does make a covenant with Abram about how he's going to give him the land, not just descendants. And what we read is in Genesis 15:12, it happened as the sun went down that a deep sleep fell on Abram. Once again, may not seem like a big deal. Deep sleep is one word in Hebrew, and that word shows up only one other time in the in Genesis. And it's when Adam is put to sleep so that Eve can be made out of him. We read in Genesis 2:21-22, Yahweh God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs, closed up the flesh where it had been. And Yahweh fashioned the rib which we had taken from the man into a woman and brought her to him. So this weird theme of God sustaining, completing, delivering humanity comes to play in some really interesting ways. Now, you may not buy all of that, and that's fair. I respect that. But what we have in the following narrative kind of ties all of this motif together in a way that I think helps us make good sense of God's promise to Abraham about the stars. So Abram has been promised descendants that will come from him. He's been promised a land. The next chapter, him and Sarah start conniving. We read in Genesis 15 that Sarai, the wife of Abram, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian female slave, and her name was Hagar. Now, in Hebrew, Hagar is literally the word the immigrant. And Sarai said to Abram, look, please, Yahweh has prevented me from bearing children. Right? She's old. She's not going to have a child. Please, go into my servant. Perhaps I will have children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Now, I didn't cover this, but when God makes that little poem about crushing the head of the serpent, the first thing he says to Adam is, because you listen to the voice of your wife, da-da-da-da. Then Sarah, the wife of Abram, took Hagar, just like same word, lakach, taking from the tree, took Hagar. And after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to Abram, her husband. Just like Eve took the fruit and gave it to her husband, here Sarai taking Hagar and giving her to his wife as if she's the fruit. And Hagar conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress grew small in her eyes. And Sarai said to Abram, may my harm be upon you. I had my slave sleep with you. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May Yahweh judge between me and you. And Abram said to Sarai, and this is pretty damning, he said, your slave is under your authority. Do to her that which is good in your eyes. And Sarai mistreated her, and she flees into the wilderness. Right? She's exiled. You can see, once it's pointed out, all the ways that this narrative has been very precisely mapped onto Genesis 3. And it follows a chapter after, we have all these little details mapped out in Genesis 2. You have Abram and Sarai both being the representatives of God, the ones who are given all of this blessing and all this opportunity, and are also squandering it immediately after. And next week, we're going to be talking through the consequences of what Abram and Sarai do there. But for today, I want to back up briefly, and I want to highlight this brief glimmer in Abram's story where he believes, he trusts what God says to him. And it's reckoned to him as righteousness. Because Paul and James are both going to make a big deal about this in the New Testament. And so I want to read the section one more time, our passage today, Genesis 15. And I just want to highlight a few things in light of this theme that we're paying attention to of doing what's good in God's eyes and trusting his perception, or doing what's good in our own eyes. Genesis 15. And behold, the word of Yahweh came to him saying, this person, Eliezer, will not be your heir, but your own son will be your heir. And he brought him outside and he said, count the stars if you're able to. So shall your offspring be. Now for us, this is a beautiful image, but I don't think the way it hits us as it ought to. There's a psalm that I think will help us get there. Psalm 8, 3-5, it reads this. It says, when I look at the heavens, the skies, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you set in place, what is a human being that you think of him? And you made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. In ancient Eastern thought, the stars and the heavenly beings were mapped onto each other. They were seen as symbols of, or just the reality of, heavenly beings. And so here's the psalmist looking at the night sky and saying, oh my gosh, your heavenly host, your army of angels is incredible. It's beautiful. What are human beings? Little dust creatures, right? That you would think of us. That you would make us kings and queens of a creation just a little lower than the angels. Paul, in his letters, he makes this weird little statement where he says, don't you guys know that in the new creation you're going to be ruling over the angels? And all of us say, no, Paul, I didn't know that. Almost certainly he has this verse on his mind. And so when Abram is shown the heavenly host, when he's shown God's heavenly army and power and sheer numbers, and said, your offspring is going to be like them, oh, that's beautiful. That's a powerful portrait. And it's really interesting. There, last year at Vineyard's regional conference, I think it was last year. I don't actually remember when it was. There was a night that I went out and went on a walk in the park after one of the services or whatever. It was pretty late. It was probably 10, 11. And I remember walking around a pond, and I came to a kind of one of those lone, really big trees, just like in the middle of a park, and no one's around. And I looked up, and the stars were just gorgeous. And I literally had a moment where God highlighted this narrative in my brain and said, I make a commitment to you. And I was like, what? And he's like, nothing. So all I know is that there's something along the lines of God's going to be with me that I experienced in that moment. And it was this profound, beautiful picture that gave me such a resonance with Abram in this moment. But I don't have a whole lot else to build out of it. But what's really cool, what's really important, what's really significant about that personal story of mine and what happens to Abram here is that this is an encounter with God. Abram is only going to know what is good in Yahweh's eyes if he knows Yahweh, if he's relational, if he has encounters with Yahweh. And the same is absolutely true of us as believers. For us to have the Holy Spirit dwelling in our midst and inside of us is this radical idea that we get to have intimate relationship with Yahweh at all times, especially when we're gathered. So we can definitely know him. And out of knowing him, we're encouraged to be transformed into the image of Christ, like him. And so Abram, at the end of this verse, he believes in Yahweh, and Yahweh reckons it to him as righteousness. So there's this brief moment where Abram encounters the promise, and in his heart, he really trusts it. And what is so precious about that to me, on the one hand, going back to what Christian talked about last week, this is another example of that patient endurance and waiting seasons that I think is really powerful for us to reflect on and internalize. But there's another element, going back to how I opened this sermon, that I think is also important. To be the people of God means that our perspective, our sense of all things has to be rooted in his promises. And he's promised us that the snake has been crushed in Jesus. And we don't always see that. He's promised us that there is a new creation, a new eschaton, a new age waiting for us that has already arrived and not yet fully. We sit in this tension of the now and the not yet. And there's something about that now and the not yet which doesn't feel that nowish, right? In many ways, I think it's very easy to feel like Abram, sitting in the promise, not much else. But here's the profound, important step. Abram believes Yahweh, and when he is most faithful, he takes steps that are countercultural and frankly ridiculous because of his trust in the promises of Yahweh that have not yet materialized. And those promises for a reality that he has not yet experienced but is trusting in cause him to live in such a way that he becomes a blessing to those around him. The moments where he does trust Yahweh, someone like Melchizedek comes up and says, "Oh my gosh, you're great. Here's a feast." The moments that he does trust Yahweh are moments that a bunch of wells are getting, set up everywhere, and all the nations are streaming to him and being, "Oh my gosh, like you're cool. This is awesome," right? For Christians, most of what we believe is frankly ridiculous if Jesus has not been resurrected from the dead and if he's not coming again. And so if we are too pragmatic and too realistic about where things are right now, we're going to be like Basil saying to his brother Gregory, "Listen, that's a nice sentiment, but this is a necessary evil. It's not realistic." And so I want to encourage for you in your own life and encourage for us in the church is that we would persistently have Holy Spirit encounters where we hear and we receive and we believe, we trust in the promises of God over our own lives and the promises he's made for his people, for his creation, for the world that cause us to live radically differently. One of the calls that has commonly been associated with preachers is that our job is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. So if you're here today and you're just trying to get by, screen out this next bit for a second. But if you are here today and you feel pretty confident in Jesus, you feel pretty confident in the faith, I want to hopefully convict you in a way that will hopefully convict myself as well. There are a lot of things that I don't think we as the church have taken to their full implication out of Jesus' teaching. And I'm going to say some things that can easily be construed as primarily political, and politics play a role in these things, but these are far more than political, friends. These are things that our own lives should affect the way we engage with them. The story of Hagar emphasizes the way that we treat the immigrant, right, among us. And I want to say that the church doesn't have a great track record of that right now, the refugee, the immigrant, who Israel was always called to care dramatically for. So that doesn't necessarily mean you need to pursue what you think is political action that does this or that or whatever, but in your own life and in your own treatment of outsiders, how do you treat them? And are you willing to do what is frankly unrealistic or dumb because it represents the kingdom Jesus has promised is already here? We talked about the environment a couple weeks ago. It's really easy for us to not care a whole lot about it, and this is pointed at me heavily, especially when there's things like we're always hearing about climate change and that and the other and not seeing the tangible results. Here's the reality. If and when climate change has tangible results, it won't be on us. It will be on coastlands in third world countries where people don't have the means to survive what's coming. And in history, we see actually a lot of movements of human peoples and civilizations because of dramatic shifts in the climate. Just take that on board seriously, whatever that looks like in your own life. Not just the climate, but also how we're caring for creation, like Christian was talking about. How about abortion? Again, these are fraught issues. I'm not trying to simplify them. But when I think of the example of Macrina going out and seeking out abandoned infants in trash heaps, and rescuing them and raising them as her own. She wasn't offloading that and saying, this is some problem that the Roman government needs to fix, or offloading it and saying, this is something that the church needs to get behind me on. She was just going and doing it. And I'm not asking y'all to do that, but maybe I am. Maybe we should be doing more for foster care and for orphanages and for the abandoned, right? Maybe we should be doing more for the children that are difficult, the people that are difficult. How comfortable are we with that reality? The early church was wildly lambasted for being unpatriotic to the Roman Empire and being largely pacifist. Now, I'm not going to say everyone needs to be a pacifist, but what does it say that the Christian church today is largely associated with our patriotism for country and our love of things like guns? Is that a good witness? It might be realistic. I want to defend my property. I want to defend this, that, and my own. But how does that square with Jesus saying, turn the other cheek? How does it square with Jesus saying, love your enemy and your oppressor? It's realistic. It's pragmatic. Is it good in God's eyes? Does it live as if the kingdom has already arrived? I could go on and I could go on and I could go on and make an enemy out of everyone in here. It's not my purpose. I don't want to stand before God or to stand behind the generations that are going to follow us, assuming that they do, who are going to look back and they're going to ask, why didn't you see this? I want to be so profoundly enraptured with the perspective of God on my life, on my people, on my church, on the way things ought to be. That my encounters with him shape my perception of reality, so I start living into it in dumb ways. And out of all of us living into dumb ways, the world's changed. Because guess what, friends? That happened in the Roman Empire. We are not cognizant of how radically the Christian church shifted and changed Western civilization, especially in the Roman Empire, but it did. And it's powerful and it's beautiful. And a lot of it came through tremendous suffering and martyrdom. And seeing in the example of Jesus Christ, someone who would forgive those who were crucifying him and would say, they don't even know what they're doing. But I'm going to defeat death. I'm going to rise from the dead. I'm going to create a new way of life. And he's called you and me into that way of life.
Thanks for listening to the Lakewood Vineyard podcast. We encourage you to respond to what you've just heard by sharing a prayer request with us on our Connect card. You can find these on our app or our website at lakewoodvineyard.org/connect. You can also respond by being generous as God has been generous to you. If you'd like to give a financial gift, you can do so at lakewoodvineyard.org/give. We hope to hear from you soon. Thanks for listening.